cheer. To climates unknown did courageously steer. Through oceans to deserts for freedom they came, and dying bequeathed us their freedom and fame. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready, steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as free men, our money.
Cool. Welcome, everyone. My name is Doug Ulwick. I'm the president of the Historical Society of Old Abington. Thank you for joining me for our third and final fall semester of conversations. We do a series of 3 in the fall. October, November, December for Sunday, and then resume again in March, April, May. And we'll be meeting over the next couple of months to figure out what those topics will be. You see up on the screen our first program for this past season, the Rockland Holiday Stroll, which happened last week. Hopefully many of you got a chance to go and enjoy it, but we had a chance to talk with the people who run it, who organize it. And that one is available, as all of ours are, up on YouTube, and sometimes through local cable. So you're welcome to see what we had to say about that. And then last month we met with the Abington Celebrates folks and talked about, as I say, origins and evolutions, and where they can come from, what are they doing, how do they get there. And that was a great program. That is now up on YouTube. I need to put the link out there, but that is now available on YouTube as well. So that's going on. And also something I want to keep bringing up is we have reinvented our essay and historic writing program. And thanks to 3 people who I think are in the room right now, Deb Damon and Eileen and Marilyn. The 3 of them pulled this back together, made some changes in it. This was the Martha Campbell essay contest. We hadn't done it for a few years. We hadn't had any entries for a few years. So it's been kind of revamped. It's become 2 prizes, a $200 prize for a, quote, adult entry. And now it can be a video as well as a written piece. And then we've also instituted a student version of the same, a $100 prize. And again, could be a video, could be written, could be whatever we need it to be. On the table back here at the entry, you'll find entry forms for them. And the deadline for this coming year's or this season's event will be the end of February. So you need to get your stuff in by then. But we're really looking forward to having a healthy amount of submissions and interesting pieces that we can review and award prizes to. So anyway, and I've skipped one of the most important things we always do. No one told me, no one said, hey Doug, what about the salute to the flag? So anyway, if you would join me please for a moment and let's offer a salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. It can't be a meeting unless we do that. So normally I'm right on top of it. Anyway, today's program is something I'm very excited to offer you. We have Wayne William Tucker with us. If he looks like the picture, he's standing over there. And anyway, it's an interesting topic. It involves some interesting sources. I think his challenge today is to limit the focus because he could talk for hours and days on this topic and it's so diverse, but we're going to kind of focus in one direction. I want to remind everyone that this is a conversation. If you want to jump in with a question or whatever, know more about something, raise your hand, let me know, and if it's something we haven't addressed yet that we're going to, fine. If not, we'll jump into it. It's the way it goes. We'll meet for about 45 minutes to an hour and see how much of the topic we can cover at that point. So, Wayne, join us. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here. I always like to start with a little bit of how you got to where you are today with your work and everything else. Now, you are an Abington native,
Grew up in Whitman.
Whitman, okay, close enough. That was Abington. So.
Yeah, my mom went to Abington High School. My grandparents went to Abington High School.
What happened to you?
We got a deal in Whitman.
There you go. Okay.
And I live in Rockland currently, so even though I've lived elsewhere in the state, I very much know this town, this community. I grew up going to the United Church of Christ in Abington, which is very much the epicenter of a lot of my work focused in Abington.
It would be.
And so, although I have this kind of regional perspective, I do have very strong roots here in the old Abington area.
And relative to what we're speaking to today, most of you know, but we have a cable audience here who may not know, that Abington today was back in the day what was Abington, Rockland, Whitman, and even part of Hanover. So the Abington that was established in 1712 was considerably larger than the one today. And in order to establish that town, this area was just the north fringes of Bridgewater previously, but when they wanted to establish a town, they needed a plan and they needed a learned minister. And they tried Elder or something, his name skips my head right now, but he wasn't acceptable. So they brought in Sam Brown, who I'm certainly will be talking about. So he was the first minister in Abington, and he had a long reign. But a lot of the topics certainly revolve around the first church and the first minister. So I'm not quite sure how to dive in, except to say we're talking about slavery. And it had a lot of different names. They didn't necessarily call it slavery, but there's a preconceived notion that has come down to us that slavery was bringing black people from Africa, but that isn't necessarily true either.
It is true, but one of the myths that we have to fight is that slavery was uncommon in Massachusetts, that it was very rare. And the fact was it was very mundane. Everyone around in Plymouth County, everyone in eastern Massachusetts, and probably all of Massachusetts, New England, would have been aware of African black chattel slavery. But to get to Doug's point, where did slavery begin in Massachusetts? There were two very early colonial wars. The Pequot War, which is also referred to as the Pequot Massacre, because war kind of euphemizes the imbalance of power between the colonial powers of Massachusetts, New Haven, and Connecticut, and the Native Americans at the time, which were the Pequots. It's a very complicated story. The English colonists, along with their native allies, basically in 1736 carried out this capture and kill mission against the Pequot Indians. And when the surrender happened, a lot of the women and children were taken as domestic servants or slaves, and the men were sold out of the colony. They were sold to Barbados, they were sold to Africa and the Wine Islands, just sold into slavery, decimating the population. The first record of African slaves that we have in Massachusetts is the slave ship Desire, and this is mentioned by John Winthrop in his diary. So those Pequot captives were sent to, I want to say, either Barbados or Providence Island, and they were exchanged for African men who were brought back, African men and women who were brought back in 1638 and sold in Salem and Boston. So even though there's good evidence that there was African chattel slavery before 1738, we know for a fact, we have the documentation that says 8 years after John Winthrop landed, 18 years after the Pilgrims landed, we were importing, meaning the white English settlers of New England, were importing African and African descended slaves into the colony.
And you said we, and I'm going to bring that up for a moment because your heritage actually traces back.
Yes. When I say we, like if you don't fall into the we, if like you just got here like last week, please forgive me. But this area is definitely filled with people who have been here since 1630, 1640, 1650, and I do include myself in that. And I think the Historical Society of Old Abington definitely, in the Dyer Memorial Library, definitely capitalizes on those connections. Mm-hmm. So if you want to absolve yourself from the we, that's up to you. But,
I don't think it's even absolving. It's just understanding that you have a connection dating back to Mayflower, I'm assuming, or nearly.
Yes. my very casual research says that I have at least 4 Mayflower ancestors.
Yeah, there you go.
And it's fine if those don't pan out, because if it's not them, it's somebody else almost as early. You know what I mean? It's not that important to be like the exact Chubbuck.
Oh, I don't know. I look around the room and I can actually point out a few.
Right? But yeah, like...
Who go all the way back.
Yeah, 1620, 1630, you know, the Levitts, the Chubbucks, the Cobbetts, definitely a lot of Scituate, Plymouth,
Right.
Hingham ancestors. Because with big math, after you get past your grandparents, it's very easy to get to like 1,000 ancestors.
Oh, absolutely.
Within,
no question.
10 generations.
Now, jumping up to 1711, by the time that Abington was saying, no, Abington wasn't, the northern fringes of Bridgewater, just over the line from the first political boundary in this country, actually, was between what became Abington and Weymouth. And a lot of what was driving it was actually like Jacob Nash from Weymouth, who was instrumental in Abington forming. But they latched onto a minister, and they latched onto Sam Brown.
Yep.
He came with some baggage.
He did. And one thing I want to make clear is, we'll talk about Sam Brown in a second, but there was slavery in Abington before Abington was Abington.
Right.
We have a record from David Axtell's diary in 1710 where he's paying 2 different enslaved African men for different tasks, for carting wood and for tanning the hide of a dog. David Axtell was a tanner, and he tanned horses and cows and dogs. And
dogs.
And forth. It was just the nature of frontier life. But one of the reasons we know that African slavery or African descended slavery existed in Abington before the establishment of Abington was that. Now, Samuel Brown comes from Essex County.
I have no prompting to change slides. We're just kind of...
Jump ahead to the Samuel Brown slides.
Or ahead to the Samuel Brown. Where are we?
And next one? Yeah.
There you go. Okay. We'll jump.
So Samuel Brown came, and he married into the Woodbridge family. And the Woodbridge family is a very significant so both very wealthy in Essex County and very significant in the West Indies for trading, for the slave trade and for the business of slavery. So sugar plantations, cotton, tobacco plantations. They were very wealthy.
So it came from his wife's side. Dorothy, perhaps?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so. That's the best guess.
Okay.
So within, I think the earliest record we have of enslaved people within Brown's Dowry is 1736, but they were clearly here before that. So if they didn't come with his wife to Abington, they were already in his possession, or it probably leveraged family connections back from Newbury, which was one of the major. So if Boston was the epicenter of slavery in Massachusetts, places like Newbury, Salem, and Scituate were the other suburban,
the perimeter,
coastal epicenters of slavery.
Okay.
And there's a good chance that the enslaved people were born in Newbury.
Interesting.
So they might have been first or second generation, and they had at least 3 more generations after them born in Abington.
Yeah.
So by the time you get to the Revolution, you have 4 generations of this African family that has lived in Massachusetts.
Born here.
So almost as long as my family has been in Massachusetts, this one family was in Massachusetts at that time.
Amazing.
So like you think about who it is who built, quote unquote built, there was already people here, but who quote unquote built the English society? Of course it was our English ancestors from the Great Puritan Migration. But there were generations of black people alongside. They weren't one-off nodes. They weren't, unfortunately in the West Indian slave plantations, they couldn't reproduce because they were killing enslaved people, working them to death about 5 years. You had like a 5-year lifespan. If you arrived in Jamaica or Barbados, you had 5 years if you're lucky.
And they weren't good years.
Of course not.
No.
So the West Indies was wholly dependent on importing new bodies into their plantations. Whereas Massachusetts, you don't want to ever say like, well, it was better for enslaved people in Massachusetts. You don't want to really get into that comparison, but there was a lot more, increase in the population, natural increase in the population, and they had to go somewhere. And usually they stayed pretty close by, for the most part.
And I think it's also important as we talk about Sam Brown, okay, he was a minister. What does that mean? A minister back then, the reason you needed to have a map and a learned minister is the learned minister had the education. He could read, he could write, he could do legal documents. He was basically the law, if you will, somewhat deputized into being the legal authority in the town. So Sam Brown coming here, he came here as in a position of power. He really
Right.
did. And he set the tone.
And he got a 60-acre farm, which if you read
That's
the
part of the deal.
So how do you run a 60-acre farm when you need to write sermons, when you need to perform emergency baptisms during the week, when you need to minister to people's spiritual needs, when you have to give learned guidance
Yeah.
outside of this? A lot of times ministers were considered the town physician in lieu of a trained
As well,
physician.
yeah.
So how do you do all this stuff and manage a 60-acre farm? Well,
You have help.
you have forced help,
Exactly.
involuntary help.
Absolutely. So, and so I mean, this is part of the fabric of Abington, as you said, before Abington, but it came with the founding of Abington.
Yes.
Now there were other families, I trust, in addition to the Browns, that.
Yeah, one of the families, the Nash family, there's a 1725 probate file of the Nash family that shows enslaved people, and the Nash family, the Nash men, were house rights, and they built houses here in Abington.
They built the first church.
They built the first and the second church.
Yeah.
There's no record right now of enslaved labor working on the first and second church of Abington, but you better believe if it's hard work being done by the enslaver, the enslaved people are doing it too.
By one of the church constructions, there was a talk of entertainment being like cuff and whatever. I mean, they were using what we understood as slaves to be song and dance.
There
and
are
entertainment.
if you look into Benjamin Hobart's
Yes.
history of Abington,
Right.
there are some stories in there about enslaved people, and some of it you can back up with the documentation. Others
Not so much.
seem a lot like folklore.
Yeah.
And if you read Benjamin Hobart closely, he's a flaming racist because he is telling, it's evil for the races to mix, and they don't have viable children and they die early, because he's writing this right after the Civil War. Benjamin Hobart was no friend of the Abington abolitionists. He was more on the Webster side of, slavery might be bad, but let's keep it so we can keep the Union together. So take a lot of that folklore from the Benjamin Hobart book, that either you have it on your shelves or it's very easy to find online nowadays.
Absolutely.
Or you can come here and read a physical copy. But a lot of it is racist caricature of folklore. So I
Interesting.
don't know,
If that happened.
I don't know to what extent,
Okay. Interesting. The Hobarts were very wealthy from South Abington and had mills there, and were actually very active in having the second church of Abington
Right.
established in what we would now call Whitman today. He was the driving force behind it.
Yeah,
The
and
family
Aaron
was.
Hobart enslaved a man named Jack and a woman named Billa, who were raised in Hanover, Massachusetts.
But once again, you expect that factory owners, particularly industrial owners from then, and powerful people like that, this is just the way they live.
It is, and another good point is, you talk about factory owners, slave ownership or enslaving people cross-class. Ministers, doctors, lawyers, absolutely were enslavers. Merchants were absolutely enslavers. But barrel coopers, blacksmiths, foundrymen, shipwrights, house carpenters.
You needed cheap labor, you got it.
Right. So if you say, well, my family was of the working class, it was the craftsman class, there's no possible way my family could have been enslavers, well, I got news for you.
Yeah.
Even some of the most poorest people in the county were gifted infants.
Wow.
In 1791, the Reverend Jerry B. Belknap, he formed the Massachusetts Historical Society, and one of the things in his diary, he wrote that enslaved children, once they were finished weaning from their mothers, they were given away, and this is a quote, enslaved children were given away like puppies.
Wow.
And if you want to advance the slide, maybe three more? One more. So this is 250 years ago yesterday. This is from the Boston Weekly Newsletter, December 2nd, 1773. this estate from Dedham is being liquidated, and what do we see? To be sold, belonging to the estate, 4 likely Negro children. And it gives age descriptions, boy and girl. And the chances of that one person would buy all 4 of those children and keep them in the same household and raise them as a family is very small. Very small. I want you to think about what you know about slavery in Massachusetts already. You're like, well, this is the first time hearing about it. I think most of you have heard of Phyllis Wheatley. And we know about Mr. Wheatley and Mrs. Wheatley and Phyllis Wheatley, but what is missing from that? Where are Phyllis's parents? She was separated in Africa from her parents. We talk about the exceptionalism of Phyllis Wheatley. She was this genius, this Mozart level, once in 250 years genius. We talk about how exceptional she is. But what she had in common was so many children, black, native, mixed, enslaved children in colonial Massachusetts, is she was part of this greater story of family separation. So whatever you want to say about how enslaved people were treated in Massachusetts, the one thing you can always default back upon is that they always had to worry about whether their child was going to be ripped away from them, whether their husband was going to be ripped away from them, brother, sister, parent. You never knew when, even if you have the most benevolent enslaver, if he dies and the estate administrator wants to split up your family, guess what? Guess how much say you have in that? 0.
Yeah. Now, early on, there were also indentured servants. Were they not coming from Europe?
Yes, white indentured
which
servants.
is a different plateau here.
And to remind
because they
everyone,
could get out of it.
Right. You served your time.
Right.
And you were allowed to marry as an indentured servant. Your kids were untouchable. So to contrast white indentured servants with, enslaved black people. If you came here as a white indentured servant, you never had to worry about having a child and having them sold to Virginia or Jamaica or Maine or Dedham.
You had privilege.
Right. There are instances, and I don't want to aggrandize white indentured servitude. It was an awful system. Like just the system of bound labor in colonial America and in England was pretty terrible, and people had to face terrible conditions. But even with Scottish POWs who were prisoners of war sold into Massachusetts, sometimes they ended up marrying the master's daughter.
Okay.
You can't imagine, an enslaver saying, "Here you go, Cuffy, marry my daughter."
Yeah. No.
And, you can't imagine. And they had children, and their families just blended into society in a way that was impossible for this population.
And something that you and I have touched on is the blending of Native American and black slave labor was pretty common.
It was, because what happened, we talked about those colonial wars, and it kind of ramped up after King Philip's War. Even more Native American men were sold out of the colonies or just slaughtered. So again, you have this dearth of Native women, and you have a dearth of black men because you imported mostly stronger, male
Workers
instead of people.
Absolutely.
So people who appear in records as mixed race in colonial Massachusetts, a lot of times that is not a product of a white and black marriage or a white and native union. It is a product of black and native. It's very much unlike what we know about slavery in the antebellum South, where there was motivation to visit sexual violence on black enslaved women in order to increase the population, increase the workforce. That motivation was not something that was a factor here in Massachusetts. Now, it did happen. There are stories where a minister enslaves a black woman, and all of a sudden a child who's maybe a little lighter complexion than her mother appears.
Surprise.
Right, and there's definitely unions between Native women and white men. But when you're looking at records of mixed race people in colonial Massachusetts, the default assumption should be that there's probably some black heritage and some Native heritage.
Okay. The intermixing was just very natural in that case.
Yeah.
And there was no stigma attached to it.
I don't think so.
As you were talking about,
the populations are so small.
No one's going to turn to Cuffy and say, you know,
No, like
marry my daughter, but
Right.
a Native American and
Right.
and
you know, like everybody seeks love, and you know, if your dating pool is small,
yeah.
you know, I think there was a preference to keep things within the community, but you know, the other pressures involved just made it a reality.
And pardon me if I'm going to jump here, but it's just something that's coming to my head from all we're talking about here. You came at all of this from a very interesting route. I mean, you worked for the U.S. Postal Service, you worked in food service, and now you're at Harvard.
I'm at Harvard, yes.
This seems to be, from just a big, broad overlook, the whole awareness of this seems to be entering the consciousness of the state, the nation, whatever. I mean, recently we've heard that there's a move to rename Faneuil Hall in Boston because Peter Faneuil
Yeah.
was a slave owner. But it's almost like who wasn't at that point. But,
Well, he also made a lot of his fortune in the slave trade.
so it was the next step up.
Yeah, so
Okay.
you know,
But-
whatever you think about the Faneuil Hall thing, just to be clear, and I'm not taking a position here, like we could talk about it later if you want, but he not only enslaved people, but he made a lot of his fortune,
Doing that.
you know, and if it wasn't trading people directly, it was trading in goods produced by people or trading in goods in order to trade for goods
Got it.
produced by enslaved people.
The whole circle of commerce that
Right.
was involved there. When did Harvard start to get really interested in this?
2017.
Okay.
They, the long story is Brown University, Ruth Simmons was the president of Brown University, and she said, hey, Rhode Island was the richest colony in the United States after the Revolution, and that was because of the slave trade.
Interesting.
More than Virginia, more than New York, more than Massachusetts. And a lot of these people involved in the slave trade, Brown, DeWolf, had a lot to do with Brown University. Let's look into it. And that kind of kicked off, and Harvard, being Harvard, was kind of late to the game. So this happened in 2006. So finally in 2017, someone said, hey, maybe we should look into it. And in 2020, a report was issued, maybe 2021, a report was issued that laid out maybe 9 or 10 different suggestions.
Mm-hmm.
And with those 10 suggestions, or those number of suggestions, they secured a $100 million endowment for the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery Initiative,
Wow.
of which my department is one of, there's one department for each one of those recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
And so my department is the Harvard Slavery Remembrance Program. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the population of people that were enslaved by Harvard leadership, faculty, and staff, and trying to connect them to direct descendants today. Just to kind of
Very,
prove,
very personal approach.
very personal approach, just to show that, you know, of course, you know, black people in Massachusetts migrated north from the Great Migration, or they came from Chicago, or they came from the West Indies, you know, in the 60s or whatever. But there was this population that's always been here.
Mm.
And why did they get here? Partly it was because of Harvard.
Yeah, there you go.
You know, and when I say partly, I'm underselling it.
Well, again, Sam Brown, our first minister, guess where he went to school?
Yeah, and guess where he was on the Board of Overseers?
There you go. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, no big surprises there. Deb.
I just wanted to get back to you. Both have mentioned Cuffy a couple of times. And
Shit, I think he's in
are you
here.
going to go back and talk a little bit about
We can.
people who are actually here? Because Cuffy was one of those, right?
Yeah, I didn't prepare like a comprehensive list, but go back to Sam Brown. Here we go. So there's a list of about 30 people that were here in Abington that were either black, mixed, or native, and some were enslaved and then freed. And I didn't want to. The problem with slides, if you just give a wall of text, sometimes it goes over. So I just wanted to isolate the people that were enslaved on Samuel Brown's property, and one of them is Cuffy Rosaria. So here, Rose is probably the matriarch, and then Anthony and Bathsheba, and look at all the children that they had
Yeah.
who would have been enslaved on Samuel Brown's property. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know if they were allowed to grow up and live, because we don't really, because what happens is this cohort moves to the Pratt farm on High Street with Josiah Torrey. but we kind of lose track of a lot of these children. Maybe they died young, infant mortality rate was a thing. Maybe they were given away or sold. And then we have Cuffy Rosaria, and then Bess Gould is the father of Bristol Gould, and who married a great-granddaughter of Massasoit. And then Caesar and Flora. And we have here an excerpt. This is written by Samuel Brown. This manuscript is in the Reverend Samuel Brown's hand in 1741. And he says, "My Negro man called Caesar and my Negro woman called Flora made a relation of a wonderful work of God's grace, wrought upon their souls, owned the covenant, and were baptized." This is basically a church membership. For those of you not really familiar with the Protestant tradition, or the congregational tradition, every congregation kind of writes up their charter, their rules of what you're going to believe in, and you have to say, yes, I believe in that. And in this period of time, you'd have to make a confession of your relationship with God, and I'm also wicked, I drink a lot, and maybe I think about these things, so you'd have to do that. And they were baptized. So this idea that this population was invisible, this would have happened in front of the whole church. And this would have happened in almost every single church from Kittery, Maine, or further north Maine to New York City, to Springfield, Mass, to Rutland, Vermont, everywhere. These people were, even though they were segregated and they were of a lesser class, so they wouldn't get full voting rights the same way the men who owned the covenant would. They were a part of, if you were required in Puritan times to go to church every week, or at least most of the time, and the minister is bringing his enslaved people and other people are bringing their enslaved people, there's no plausible deniability. Right. Did you have a question?
No, I was just, didn't Cuffy Rosario go to Boston and serve in the military?
He did, absolutely.
Revolutionary War, yeah.
Right, yeah.
He did. He was a part of the siege of Boston. So after the Lexington Alarm, 1775, the local Massachusetts militia routed the British back into Boston, which at the time was a very small peninsula, and so they besieged the city and kept everybody inside. So there was fortifications from, say Winthrop and Chelsea, all the way through Cambridge,
down to Dorchester Heights,
Dorchester.
Yeah.
And Cuffy Rosario was stationed in Roxbury. And he later, I believe, he joined the Continental Army. There's a great publication that Martha Campbell put out here at Abington called Abington and the Revolution, and it says that Cuffy died in 1775. I don't think that's true. I think she mistook him for a different Cuffy. And this Cuffy went on to live a longer life and served further in the Revolutionary War. And there were 5 veterans that served in the Revolutionary War here in Massachusetts, in Abington.
Is it right if they served in the Revolutionary War, they would be given their freedom?
That, not necessarily. But that's what happened a lot of the time.
Because I know Abigail Adams' brother, William, was given a man, 10-year-old black boy named Cato. Mm-hmm. And he served in the American Revolution, and he was promised his freedom, but he died in the American Revolution.
In the war?
Yeah.
There are definitely cases. I can point to a case of a man in Marblehead who comes from South Kingstown, Rhode Island, and this rich guy says, well, my son's supposed to go off and fight in the war, but if you go, you'll get your freedom. And there's estimates between 10 and 20% of men in Connecticut were promised their freedom in
lieu of
to get revolutionary service.
Yeah.
In Massachusetts, I don't see a lot of guarantees of freedom. I think what happened was slavery was petering out by the time the revolution came. And so when they got back after serving 3 years in West Point and Valley Forge, they just said, no, we're not doing this anymore. What are you going to do? You just had this whole thing, this whole big deal. Yeah. And if you remember, one of the metaphors that, even here in Abington, that the English used, or the colonists used against the monarchy, is taxation is slavery. And we will not bear the yoke of slavery from London. And so I think a lot of people, especially Elizabeth Freeman out in Western Massachusetts, basically said, what the heck? We're the ones actually enslaved here.
Right.
And so I think a lot of men were given their freedom because of the revolution, whether formally or informally. But I think a lot of them just there was so much chaos, and because this was the first time they were earning wages. So they were able to come back, maybe they purchased their own freedom. Maybe they just refused to go back and purchase their own plot of land because the enforcement mechanisms to bring you back into slavery were very weak, especially in 1783 when it was ruled counter to the Constitution of Massachusetts.
Absolutely, it makes sense. I think Martha Campbell actually said that Cuffy went to which one? One of the major wars. We do have the book, by the way.
He might have been in the French and Indian War beforehand.
I think maybe, but I think it was Valley Forge. She was actually saying that he served out. This is the book, in case you have it or don't have it, and there are copies here. But this book was produced for the bicentennial, the country's bicentennial. My name is in it, so I happen to have a copy of it. I've been around that long, not since the Revolution, but since the book came out. Anyway, but it's a incredible reference. I think a lot of it's held up over the years. She was a great researcher.
Right, and what I was telling Doug, it's like anything that I found that where it hasn't held up in that book, it's only because I have these modern advantages and another 50 years of scholarship by all these historians, these academic historians that she just would not have had access to.
No. She actually, her pantry at her home on Plymouth Street was just full of notebooks. We have most of them here now after she passed, but she was a dear friend, and her research was just amazing for the time it was done.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. She was a Southern woman, and she didn't like to lecture much because she said Yankees don't like to be told their history by a Southern woman. But she wrote a lot, so and that was her wall in which she could do that, and kind of interesting. And you're beginning to talk about, and I think there are different ways it happened, the release of slaves. They came back from a war and kind of said, hey, we're done. But also, and I think we actually have in here somewhere about giving away land. Here, upon my death, you get this, and he gets this. And
yeah, there are various. What happened? So one of the challenges of slavery in a place like Massachusetts, you cannot have a cash crop. So you can't have these large tracts of land like Virginia or Mississippi or Jamaica. So as the population of black people increase, what it takes to support that population increases. So if you were a blacksmith and you enslave a 13-year-old boy, it's kind of easy to maintain that 13-year-old boy through your blacksmith trade. But now that that boy becomes a man and he starts to have children, and maybe you're going through a little bit of recession, and everybody's going through a little bit of recession, so now you have the surplus of labor, or you have people that have been free, or you have people who were enslaved, but they married a free native woman.
Mhm.
And now you have this population of, they'd be considered black, but they're not, they're free people, who all of a sudden are now encumbrances on the town. So that's one pressure being put on white society. Another pressure is there were 70 to 80 different freedom suits brought by people of color suing for their freedom, starting in the 1600s.
Interesting.
All the way up to Elizabeth Freeman in Suffield, Massachusetts in 1780, and then Quock Walker in 1783. And that final Quock Walker decision was adjudicated after the state constitution was adopted, written by John Adams, where it says all men are created free and equal. And Judge William Cushing from Scituate, who was a slave owner, so don't give him all the credit. He was a slave owner, but he read jury instructions saying that slavery is counter to the Massachusetts Constitution. And that is what began the very end of slavery. Slavery was petering out before that, so it kind of began in the 1770s.
Right.
He kind of put kind of like a death nail on it, but it was a civil rights issue. So it wasn't like a positive law saying, no, you can't have slavery. So slavery still continued into the late 1780s and early 1790s.
He left some gray areas.
He did. Like, I think about it like this. Think about civil rights law. Like, what about stop and frisk in New York? The New York City police carried out stop and frisk for like 15, 20 years until it was ruled by the Supreme Court. It was unconstitutional. Now, it had always been unconstitutional.
But
the
interpretation.
You can't enforce it until you have these higher court rulings. And if you if you're a man on the street and you don't have a lawyer on speed dial, how do you enforce those stop and
Right.
frisk laws? The same with enslaved people. I don't think they had lawyers on speed dial.
I don't think they had lawyers.
Right. Yeah, very rarely did they have access to the
Kill
law.
all the lawyers. There's one sitting in the audience. I have to be careful.
Right, but that's what I'm saying. You know, like if you don't have
Maybe there's more
attorney-
than one.
if you don't know or if you don't have access to the courts,
Right.
how do you get out of your bondage in 1785, 1786?
Absolutely. And I think out of this time also, there became advocates among the different groups, particularly, I'm thinking the Mitchells here in Abington.
Yeah, so Zervia Gould Mitchell.
And pronounce that name for me again, because I always get it wrong.
It's a biblical name, so any biblical scholars out there can correct me. But I say Zervia.
Slide for it?
No.
Okay.
Maybe it's Zervia. But Bess Gould, who is daughter of Caesar and Flora, so that's one generation. Bess Gould is the second generation. In 1759, Brister Gould is born on the Tory farm, so that's a third generation. He ends up marrying a woman named Phoebe Wamsley, who is Wampanoag, and she is great-granddaughter or great-great-granddaughter of Massasoit.
She's very lineal, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they have, I want to say 8 or 10 kids, all in North Abington. They lived on Sylvan Court, which is right off
From Lincoln
Street.
Street, yeah.
And they are buried there today. They are buried behind 50 Sylvan Court. I think on the Lincoln property conservation land, but maybe on private property. But just to let you know that they're still there. Zervia Gould Mitchell was a pioneering advocate for Native rights.
Mm-hmm.
Now she's 4th generation Abington through her African side, and she's a zillion generation Massachusetts from her Massasoit side. But she is a pioneering just advocate for just Native rights, and she was educated in Abington schools.
Mm-hmm.
So she was born in 1803. She's probably finished with Abington schools by 1823.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for perspective, Boston public schools weren't integrated until the 1850s. So the Mitchell family definitely got their kids into school, and her children went to school in Abington. They advocated for land back, that, whether it was in Fall River or in Lakeville or in Taunton. There's several times where her and her mother petitioned the state government for land that should have been theirs by treaty.
I think we actually have a photograph of her in the
Right,
collection.
there's
here.
actually a big file here at the Dyer.
For the Mitchell.
Yeah. They were, sadly, they were written up a lot in the newspaper. So there's this myth called the disappearing Indian, the vanishing Indian. So for 100 years, there are stories on this family as the last of the Wampanoags. It's like, how can you be the last of anything for 100 years? And it's always like someone different, and obviously we know they didn't disappear. They just either were ignored or excluded or kept a low profile for safety reasons.
But ultimately, they were seen as very representational, but I think really played up the Wampanoag aspect of their heritage more than anything else.
They did, because it was a time. Like, again, you have to play with your identity. Mm-hmm. We were talking beforehand, so there are times when Zervia Mitchell claims that her father was full-blooded Indian.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think she was trying to be deceptive. It's a survival strategy.
Yeah.
If you got to remember, the game is rigged against these people. So if they're playing dirty, you have to use every trick in your bag
To survive.
And the thing is that we in modern lens, she's dishonest. She's obviously deceptive and trying to fool the white audience. Well, I would too if they were
She had no choice.
right.
Yeah.
Just the way they were dishonoring treaties and contracts and land obligations left and right.
Well, it's always interesting to me how Abington keeps circling around. I mean, between Sam Brown from Harvard,
Right.
marrying into the Woodbridges, having slaves at disposal from both sides, and coming here with slaves and running a farm here, and then tracking it all the way up to the Mitchells, who are loud and proud,
Right.
at the same time. And
Guys, her granddaughter doesn't die until 1894.
there you go.
And she was born in 1730, whatever, enslaved by Samuel Brown. And I think a lot of us have relatives that we can remember, even if they're not here today, who were born in the 1890s. My great-grandmother, who I remember,
Yeah.
Alcina Cobbett,
Yeah.
she
And yet Abington certainly likes to, and I think justifiably so, tie ourselves to the abolitionist movements because of Island Grove where all the speakers came. But you have to wonder how uncomfortable those people were because they weren't that many generations removed from being slave owners. And there are stories that even as the abolitionist speakers were speaking at Island Grove, there were cannons being shot off from the other side to disrupt them. So we like to think of ourselves as better than and better informed than and kinder and gentler than and always in favor of, but shaky ground.
Abington should be proud of its abolitionist heritage, but remember that it began in the 1830s and died off 1865, if you want to consider the Civil War abolitionist history. So that's 35 years. We're talking about 75 years of slavery just in Abington. 170 years in Massachusetts as a whole. So why do we only talk about the 30 years, but never the 75 years? And like Doug said, there were just as many people against abolition as there were for abolition. It's just that we don't talk about the against people. There was an attempted lynching here in Abington of a white minister who came to the First Parish Church, which is now what is now the Masonic building, or it's now the Brazilian church.
Third building.
Right, yeah. There was an abolitionist speaker coming to that church, and local Plymouth County men came with a rope and tried to hang that man for speaking out for abolition. So we should be proud of our abolitionist history, but there's a whole rich texture that goes around. You know, I don't think you can't claim credit until you get all the bad stuff.
Right.
My metaphor is you don't have Easter Sunday without talking about Good Friday. You know, Easter Sunday is not, I'm not Christian anymore. I'm not a homiletic. This is not a homily, but if you want to celebrate Easter, you have to grapple with Good Friday and Maundy, Thursday.
You have to own the whole thing.
Right, the betrayals of Jesus.
I mean, to me, it will be interesting to see how things play out, like, again, with Faneuil Hall. I mean, on the big picture for Massachusetts, at least, we're going to Faneuil Hall. Well, Peter Faneuil, yeah, okay. How much are we owning? How much are we changing and whatever? And, I mean, sports teams changing their names. So it's becoming, I mean, this is all very timely because it's becoming more visible, more in the consciousness of us today after all this time. You know, and I mean, really, where can we point to the end of it? Were you saying up to the 1890s? Some of these people certainly were living, that had been enslaved.
Slavery ended, say, 1783 or 1790, roughly. I mean, some of it goes into the early 1800s.
Yeah.
But you got to remember, a lot of the racial segregation laws, anti-miscegenation, no integration of schools, no integration of the federal workforce, a lot of that stuff, that started in slavery and didn't change just because slavery became illegal. So
we lived with it for some time.
A long time.
Yeah.
Some places more than others, but the federal workforce wasn't integrated until the 1940s. 1940s,
right?
Exactly. Like, come on.
We were fighting World War II,
right.
World War One, and World War II, for that matter.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting, like the revolution. We should go one. We should end on and then get maybe questions.
Okay. Which slide do you want?
The last one. That one.
That one. Okay.
So, the first integrated war force of the modern era was the Korean War. It was a totally segregated armed forces. At least with the Army, with the ground forces. The Navy's a little different, but as far as the Army goes. World War I was a segregated fighting force. World War II was a segregated fighting force. The Civil War and all of the wars in the 1800s were a segregated fighting force. The last truly integrated fighting force was the Revolutionary War. And no one ever told me that there were black Revolutionary War veterans from Massachusetts, let alone Abington.
But here they were.
Here they were. Cuffy Rosario Sr., his two sons, Cuffy Jr. and Silas. Primus Clavis. Now this is a very interesting document. This is a bounty list from 1782. Bounty list was every town had to raise a group of men to go fight for the war. And the way you incentivized it, especially if you had some money, you paid into the tax funds and you offered a bounty. Different towns had different amounts. So there were bounty jumpers, like maybe I'm from Bridgewater, but Abington's offering twice as much, so I'm going to go enlist for Abington. Abington likes it because they're like, well, we get the name off our rolls, and this person's going to get their cash bonus at the end of the war. So this is a document, original to 1782, of men owed a cash bonus for fighting in the Revolutionary War. And right here, it's hard to see, but primus cavus, comma, Negro. He was 16 years old when he enlisted. So he would have been an incoming Abington High School senior. I don't know if anybody you know currently an Abington High School senior, or just imagine a high school senior. A black high school senior in a very segregated, anti-black society. He signs up and he goes off to war. He fights for 3 years. He is with George Washington at Tarrytown. He witnesses the execution of the British spy, John Andre. He is a wounded veteran. He is wounded twice. He settles in Baltimore. I don't know if he ever received this bounty because he settles in Baltimore. We have his Revolutionary War pension. He gets married. He has, I can't remember if it's like a stepdaughter or his child of his own, but he's advocating for himself in the 1830s. Like, hey, I'm a wounded veteran. I fought in the Revolutionary War for Abington. I'm owed a pension. So he's a self-advocate. He's a wounded veteran. He was a 16-year-old patriot. And we've never heard about this in all of our history.
We don't talk about it.
And then Bristol Gould was in the local militia. And we talked about him a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we should open it up to the floor.
I don't disagree with that.
But
We covered a lot of ground.
I forgot why we talked about the revolution, but I hope that answers the question that was posed.
Ben.
I'm wondering, I've looked for in cemeteries like a black section, and I can't find them. Where do you find these?
You don't.
You don't? That's not good.
It's not fair. So, in fairness, a lot of poor white people didn't have stone headstones either, and so certain materials were grave markers, just disintegrate over time. For instance, my friend who runs the Hanover Historical Society is also a cemetery historian, and he says probably a tenth of the known graves, 10 to 20% of the known burials have corresponding headstones. And so that indicates that a lot of people don't have existing headstones.
Did they have a poor section or a black section in each?
Some of them did.
Graveyard?
Some of them did. Like in Rhode Island, there's good evidence of a segregated area. In Massachusetts, especially in Plymouth County, we don't know. There's no record of like where someone is buried. So we don't know if they were segregated or if they were just like kind of lumped in with the family.
And certainly family,
Right.
like the Mitchells off of Lincoln Street there. You know,
Right.
they had their own
Yeah,
cemetery.
they have their own cemetery. In Abington, there's a good manuscript here at the Dyer Memorial Library called the Topman Manuscript.
What's it called?
Topman Manuscript. It was written over 100 years ago, but it details 30 different grave sites across Abington. Mount Vernon Cemetery didn't come online until like the 1840s.
Years later, yeah.
And now the original burial ground for the church was at 325 Washington Street, which is where that auto body, I think it's Abington Auto Body is.
That was the original church site, yeah.
Yeah. The
first
thing
church.
is, the records are very fuzzy. I can't say for sure, but it does not look like people were exterred and moved, only grave sites.
They just left them there?
I can't say for sure.
Well, we do know that Island Grove had a cemetery on the North Bluff, and we know who was buried there. The headstones that remained were moved to the forefathers' lot at Mount Vernon, but we are told it was the headstones that were moved,
Right.
not
Reading
the
between the lines.
remains. So,
Reading between the lines, there's a lot of grave sites in Abington or
Yeah.
people's backyards.
Yeah.
In the Island Grove, there's a grave stump at the Island Grove. If you went to the Island Grove, you can find that grave stump.
there's a couple.
It's right next to a picnic table, and it used to be a playground. There's also the Pratt family farm, Green Street and High Street. Josiah Torrey buried his whole family up there, and I assumed a lot of the people that were enslaved on his farm were buried there too. But yeah, that's one of the things that brought me to this is like, where are all these people buried? Where are these
Because I've
buried?
been looking for some of them.
There's thousands of records. Where are they buried? And
Yeah.
the fact is,
You can't find them.
Actually, the historic inventory for the town lists, there's a whole section in there on cemeteries. And for instance, the Island Grove one is mentioned there. And we, again, have records of, I think it's the Frenches primarily, who were buried there. But there was a movement at one time to take all of the various headstones from the other cemeteries and put them in the forefathers lot at Mount Vernon. It's up at the Pearl Street end of the cemetery there. And even Ford's headstone is at Mount Vernon now. Was he originally buried there? No, but that's where the headstone is. So a lot of the headstones are there, but the bodies probably not. I think it was problematic to move whatever was left at that point, so they didn't. But yeah, I mean, when I first found the broken off stubs at Island Grove, there was a local tradition, by the way, that was an Indian cemetery,
Of course.
and I keep having to say no, it wasn't. But it's just people try to make sense of what they see,
Right.
and what they see are broken up slates.
We're better. Like, we would never leave our dead people behind an auto body shop in the island.
Sure we
They're
would. Sure we would. Absolutely. Once they're dead. Marilyn.
Sorry if this is an obvious answer or I've missed
Maybe
it
not.
somewhere along the line, but what's the significance of the 11 name?
Oh, so I was going to do this as a one-off project. I was not going to make this my whole thing. So doing my own family research, I found evidence that the Dudley family of Roxbury were enslavers. And a few months previous to me finding that, there was this whole article in the Boston Globe about changing Dudley Square in Roxbury. And there were these very credentialed professors saying, we may never find evidence that the Dudleys enslaved people. And I'm like,
It's there.
I'm sitting here on my couch during the middle of a pandemic, and so I found 11 people kind of, I don't want to say I'm rubbing their nose in it, but I'm just saying, like,
Feel free.
yeah, here's 11 people that I found. As a
From my
guy-
couch.
Yeah, as a guy, being inside during the pandemic with my computer, with no, academic credentials. So I just want to say, like, these people are here and we can find them. And then I turned my focus a lot to Plymouth County. Because, again, I didn't think I was going to find anything down here.
Surprise.
Yeah,
We knew a little bit about it, but again, it was masked.
right.
Martha's book has it if you know where to look.
So what I think one of the problems is it's compartmentalized. Abington does
Yeah.
its own research.
Yeah.
Pembroke does its own research.
Yeah.
Marshfield does its own research. And everyone's like, oh, how rare it is. But when you start to put all the towns together,
Crosses the lines.
so I did a project for the Northeast Slavery Records Index, and I found out 1,200 records of enslaved people throughout Plymouth County, up to 1783.
And again, town lines changed.
Yeah.
One of my favorite discoveries a couple of years ago is I had someone doing research post-Civil War and said, okay, Abington got 4 cannons after the Civil War. They applied for 4 cannons. I'm not in Abington. I'm using aerial studies and everything. Where are the 4 cannons? They're in Rockland. They are. There are 2 at the GAR Hall and 2 at the cemetery. Rockland couldn't ask the federal government for cannons because they fought in the Civil War, because Rockland didn't exist during the Civil War. It had to be listed as Abington because Abington had the Civil War background. But it was the funniest thing to solve, saying the town lines moved. And so again, I'm sure you're finding, okay, if we're talking about the Hobarts, well, they're not in Abington anymore, but they were then. And so trying to track all of that stuff, that the lines blur. And any researcher, we all know that, the lines blur. You try to tie something down in one place, and you can't. It doesn't work that way.
But there's so many hidden cemeteries in Old Abington.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've lived in Rockland and I've moved to Whitman. And it's really interesting being on the Historic Commission in Rockland, having no idea what was happening in
In
Whitman.
Whitman.
Yeah.
And now, to me, the big deal is to get that history together
Mm-hmm.
of the 3 towns. Because exactly what you're talking about with the cemeteries, where I live in Whitman, one of the decisions that I made on buying that property was that there was a cemetery behind my property
Oh.
that nobody knew about. And it has conservation land in between, so that means no developer is gonna be coming in between.
No.
But that cemetery is very small, but you can still bury people in it.
Wow.
And it has, I think, five of the GAR markers. And nobody knows that they're back there unless you happen to be going down Pine Street and find that particular cemetery.
Right.
I'm thinking of one off of Spring Street. Isn't there one there as well?
Off of Spring Street?
Yeah.
No, you're talking about Spring Street in
Rockland.
Yeah, I'm talking about Pine Street.
Okay, Pine Street and Whitman, sorry.
It's
Cro-
next to the-
Timelines.
Yeah, but if you talk to people who now live in Rockland, who lived on the corner of Pine and High,
Mhm.
they can tell you all about the pond, the farm, how that cemetery got there. But those are all missing things.
Yeah.
You need to have those conversations.
Absolutely.
You know, especially for the history. But when you're talking about Martha Campbell,
Mhm.
the reason that Martha started doing the research that she was doing was she had to go to Plymouth on a regular basis to take her son down to the Cushing Foundation, which was there.
Mhm.
I drove Martha for years. So
Yeah,
when she was
I did a
doing-
few times too.
Yeah, so when she was doing that, she decided she had to do something with her very active mind. And where the property that she owned in Abington had the Indian trail that went through it, and she was looking for the Indian cemeteries. And so she started in Plymouth, and she kept on going, and it blew up from there. And it's really fascinating because every time I go by her old house and where her new house is, I know exactly where that trail went right through. And I keep thinking, but there's so many trails that, and I just found one recently by talking to a person who's been there for a long time. The triangulation maps for Whitman went from, because of it being Old Abington, went from the Congregational Church in Rockland to the water tower on Beach Hill to the one on Rye Hill. The second triangulation map goes to the water tower in Whitman that's gone. But if you read the articles, it says it had a brass ball on the top of it, and that the brass ball was last seen in a stream. So find the stream. I had to find somebody who lived in that area.
Who knew where the stream
found
was.
it, and he knows, he's going to show me where the stream went, right through there. So I'm going to look for that brass ball.
Fantastic.
But you know, it's the word of mouth of history, which I think is what you're
Right, you need to get the towns together.
Yeah.
Because just like Puritan families or Great Migration families, someone from Scituate married someone from Abington, the same thing happened with these black families.
Have
Absolutely.
you looked into the database in Virginia on slavery that they're doing now in the Shenandoah?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so that, we'll talk about that
Yeah.
after, but they're doing a very concerted effort with, and I'm tracking that, because my family was slave owners in Virginia, but they were also heavily abolitionist slavery. So it's
Both sides of the coin.
Yeah.
That's what they don't look at. But the thing that's interesting is they talk about the slave grave markers. And they found quite a few of the estates as to where they had them on the plantations. And they had a different type of marker than what we have. They have like triangular stones that you would trip over if you found them. And that's the type of stone that they used for slaves. So
Interesting.
I just thought I'd pass that on.
Okay. Okay, we're going to wrap it up in a few moments and send you back to the back room for refreshments. Any last questions? And you know, he'll be here for a little bit. You can talk to him personally too. Okay, cool. First of all, thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Fascinating program. Appreciate it. Deb, there's another program happening here in a week, is
Yeah,
it?
so December 16th is the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. So next Sunday, which is the 10th, at 1 o'clock here, the Dyer is sponsoring John Galuzzo, who is a trustee of the Dyer, who is a historian and an author, who is going to talk about, and some of you may have heard him on WATD and stuff like that. Anyway, he's going to talk about the impact of the Boston Tea Party, how it was received here, and as well as talking about the Tea Party itself. So they're doing a lot of stuff in Boston around this, I know, and statewide, but it would be fun to hear something a little more local. So 1 o'clock next Sunday. right here, 1 o'clock, not 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock.
An hour earlier. Get your schedule adjusted. And on the 16th and 17th, I think it is, we're also doing a small concert here, piano, harp, and guitar. We'll do a Saturday at 4, candlelight concert. And then for those of you who don't like to drive after dark, we'll repeat it again Sunday afternoon at 2. So we hope you join us for that. It's something a little out of the ordinary, but we want to welcome people to this building at this time of year. I just revived an old tradition, and we now have Christmas candles in the front windows, and they'll stay on 24 hours. They're LED, so they don't take a lot of energy. In fact, it would cost more to run a timer to turn them on and off than it does to leave them plugged in. So the Dyer is beginning to get all dressed up for Christmas, and we look forward to that. So we hope you'll join us for the next 2 weekends, I guess. My goodness, 3 weekends in a row. Are we busy or what? Next weekend is also Abington Celebrates weekend, and it kicks off, I believe, with the Ugly Sweater Ball on Friday. And that's grown, by the way. It's really popular now. Need tickets for that? Or?
Nope, you can at the door at the Legion.
Okay, cool. And then the either activities all day Saturday or later in the day on Saturday?
Saturday from 3 to 6 is
Okay.
the lighting
At Island Grove?
Island Grove,
Okay.
all free events for
And then there's Sunday, there's a concert at UCC.
following, I think, the
Yeah,
talk.
this first. and then,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, so a lot going on for December. I'm really happy to see all this and so much revolving around Abington history and events. So we hope you do all of it. And I'll end by asking the question I always do at the end of these programs. Would the members of the Historical Society of Old Abington raise their hands? And look around, and if there are those who have not raised their hands, say hi to them and make them feel welcome. And if you want to head to the back room, we have coffee, we have tea, we have cake, we have stuff. So please go fill your faces and talk some more. Thank you all for being here.